The first mistake was letting James out of the quarantine bay without a proper medical check. The second mistake was assuming human fevers were a death sentence. Karul, a third-year medical student aboard the interspecies station Velmari, had only been assigned to human observation duty for the past 2 weeks. In that time, he had studied their physiology extensively, though. As he was quickly learning, studying humans and understanding them were two vastly different things. James had seemed fine during their last interaction, maybe a little sluggish, but when Karul found him slumped against the mess hall table, shivering and sweating in equal measure, his 3 hearts nearly stopped. Emergency transport to Medical Bay. Karul's voice clicked in his native tongue, his elongated fingers already pressing an alert beacon. The other crew members, a mix of various species, paused mid-meal. Some flicked their sensory appendages in concern, others merely observed. James groaned weakly, cracking open one unfocused eye. Karul. Stay still, James. You are in critical condition. What James blinked, confused as Karul's fellow medics arrived, lifting him onto a hover stretcher. Karul's mind raced through possibilities. Sepsis? Organ failure? Some kind of rapid onset neurological collapse? James coughed into his sleeve. Seriously, I just have a fever. Karul ignored the nonsense. The human was clearly delirious. Within minutes, they had him in the medical bay, surrounded by diagnostic equipment. Karul hovered over the scanners, watching as the readings confirmed what he already suspected. James' body temperature had soared far beyond the normal limits. His respiratory rate was elevated, his blood pressure fluctuating. A fever this high would be catastrophic for most species on the station. Karul turned to the lead physician, Dr. Velden, who observed the readings with a furrowed brow. His internal temperature is unstable. Organ function remains intact, but this state cannot be sustained. We must act quickly, Karul insisted, already preparing a cooling agent. We may be able to stabilize him if... Hold on, James interrupted, his voice weak but firm. Just, give me some soup. Karul froze. What? Soup, James repeated. Chicken noodle, if you got it. Karul exchanged a bewildered glance with Dr. Velden. Surely this was a sign of neurological degradation. James, I do not believe you understand the severity of your condition. James groaned, rubbing his face. Karul, buddy, this is just the flu. I'll be fine. The flu, Karul repeated, horrified. He scrolled through his medical database, searching for the term. Influenza? A virus that induces immune response, fever, muscle weakness, and potential respiratory distress. Yeah, James said, yawning. That. Karul couldn't comprehend it. A virus capable of raising body temperature to such dangerous levels, yet James was treating it as if it were a minor inconvenience. You are experiencing multiple systemic failures, he insisted. This is not something to be taken lightly. James sighed. I swear I just need rest and fluids. Karul wasn't convinced. He turned to Dr. Velden, who seemed equally uncertain but not as alarmed. Human resilience is well documented, the senior medic said. If he believes this is normal, we should observe before taking extreme measures. Karul's mandibles clicked in frustration, but he nodded. They set up monitoring equipment and provided hydration packs, though Karul remained tense. Every rise and fall of James' chest was scrutinized, every shift in his vitals recorded. Hours passed. James drifted in and out of sleep, grumbling about the temperature and requesting various earth foods that Karul did not understand. Do you have crackers? He asked at one point, his voice muffled against the pillow. Karul, who had spent the last 3 hours monitoring his oxygen levels in growing distress, nearly lost his patience. You are fighting for your life, and you want crackers. James cracked one eye open. Salt helps. Karul turned away, muttering under his breath. Eventually, James' fever began to drop. His vitals normalized. The crisis, if it had ever been one, passed. Karul was left staring at his unconscious patient, utterly baffled. He had seen species succumb to organ failure from far less, yet James had merely sighed, slept, and asked for soup. Humans, he decided, were terrifying. Karul barely left James' bedside, his mind still struggling to reconcile what had just happened. The human's fever had been high enough to push most species into critical decline, yet James had treated it with casual acceptance. His body had fought off the infection with only rest and fluids, no advanced medical intervention, no emergency procedures. Dr. Vel then, having seen enough, had departed hours ago, leaving Ka Rule alone to monitor the human's recovery. James was sleeping soundly now, his temperature stabilizing, his breathing steady. The monitors confirmed what Ka Rule's eyes reluctantly admitted: James was improving. Ka Rule had spent years studying medicine, memorizing the fragility of biological systems, learning the warning signs of impending failure. And yet here was James, who had suffered through what should have been a dire condition and treated it as an inconvenience. His understanding of human physiology was correct, but his understanding of humans? Deeply flawed. James shifted under the medical blankets, his face scrunching up before his eyes fluttered open. He made a soft groaning noise and rubbed at his face. How long was I out? Ka Rule checked the time. Approximately 14 hours. James blinked, then let out a slow breath. Feels about right. He sat up gingerly, rolling his shoulders. Ka Rule tensed, expecting signs of weakness or distress, but James merely winced, still sore. You are recovering from a significant immunological battle, Ka Rule informed him. Your body was in a highly compromised state. James yawned. Yeah, sounds about right. Ka Rule narrowed his gaze. You continue to act as though this was expected. James gave him a tired but amused look. Because it was? I mean, yeah, fevers suck, but I knew I'd pull through. Ka Rule could not fathom having such certainty in the face of biological chaos. You were unstable. If your fever had risen even slightly higher, your proteins could have denatured. Organ failure was a possibility. James scratched the back of his head. Sure, if I hadn't been taking care of myself, but I was drinking fluids and resting. My body knew what to do. Ka Rule folded his arms, mandibles twitching. You place a great deal of faith in your physiology. James smirked. Well, yeah, humans kind of have to. We get sick all the time. Ka Rule stared at him. You expect this? James shrugged. Sure, colds, flus, infections, our immune systems are always fighting something. It's just part of life. Ka Rule felt his stomach lurch. You mean to say that humans regularly endure such conditions? James tilted his head. Yeah? I mean, this wasn't even that bad. I've had worse. Ka Rule's mind reeled. This wasn't the worst illness James had experienced. Ka Rule had spent the last day meticulously monitoring every fluctuation in his vitals, fearing the worst, and James considered this mild. James must have noticed his expression because he chuckled softly. Don't worry, man. We bounce back. Ka Rule wasn't sure if that was reassuring or horrifying. A chime at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. The station's nutritional officer, a Velmari named Othrin, entered carrying a tray. Human James, they said, their voice a soft hum. I have brought the requested nourishment. James perked up. Oh, awesome. Othrin set the tray down beside the bed, revealing a bowl of what Ka Rule assumed was an approximation of Earth's chicken noodle soup. The broth was a golden color, with thin strips of protein and starch suspended within. It didn't look particularly impressive, but James' face lit up like it was the most valuable substance in the galaxy. Thank you, he said, already reaching for the bowl. Othrin inclined their head and departed. Ka Rule watched as James carefully lifted the spoon, blowing on the liquid before taking a sip. His shoulders relaxed immediately. Ka Rule observed in silence for a moment before finally speaking. This is truly an effective remedy. James grinned. Oh yeah, nothing beats soup when you're sick. Ka Rule frowned. But what properties does it possess that expedite recovery? James hesitated, spoon halfway to his mouth. Well, it's warm, so it helps with congestion. And it's got salt, which helps with hydration. Plus it's easy on the stomach. Ka Rule processed this. So it is not a cure, merely a comfort. James nodded. Yeah, but comfort helps. When you feel miserable, a little warmth goes a long way. Ka Rule considered this. His own species relied on clinical treatments, precise dosages of medicine. The idea that something as simple as warmth and salt could provide relief if not a cure was strangely human. James continued eating, clearly enjoying the meal. Despite himself, Ka Rule found the tension in his chest loosening. The human would be fine. Still, he would need to update the station's medical files on human illnesses. If this was something they expected, then better preparation was necessary. James set his spoon down and stretched with a groan. Man, I hate being sick. Ka Rule huffed. You endure it too well for such a claim. James laughed. Trust me, just because we get through it doesn't mean we like it. Ka Rule could respect that. Maybe humans weren't indestructible, but they were certainly something else. James remained in the medical bay for observation, though it was clear to everyone except perhaps Ka Rule that he was recovering well. His fever had broken, his strength was returning, and he had started making conversation with anyone who wandered in. Ka Rule, despite his lingering unease, continued to monitor him closely, adjusting the hydration levels in his IV and running periodic scans. James, for his part, had been remarkably patient. He answered Ka Rule's endless questions about human immune responses, described various childhood illnesses he'd suffered through, and even recounted a particularly harrowing bout of food poisoning from something called gas station sushi. Each revelation only deepened Ka Rule's concern. So, you're telling me, Ka Rule said, staring at his datapad, that your species willingly consumes food that carries a significant risk of bacterial contamination? James shrugged from his bed. Well, yeah, not all of it, obviously, but sometimes you take a gamble. Ka Rule's mandibles twitched. A gamble? With your internal stability. James grinned. Look, sometimes you're hungry, you're in a rush, and you make bad decisions. It happens. Ka Rule exhaled slowly, trying to suppress the sheer horror that statement evoked. He had spent his entire academic career learning how to preserve and protect biological functions, and James was casually admitting to jeopardizing his own for the sake of convenience. James seemed to notice his expression and laughed. Relax, man. Most of the time it's fine. Ka Rule didn't find that comforting. The door chimed, and Dr. Vel then stepped in, glancing over the monitors. Your recovery is proceeding as expected, the senior medic noted. No lingering complications. Told you, James said, stretching. I'm pretty much good to go. Dr. Vel then nodded. You may be discharged, but you are to rest for at least another 2 cycles before resuming strenuous activity. James gave a lazy salute. Yes, sir. Ka Rule wasn't sure he trusted James to follow that directive, but he didn't argue. Instead, he helped remove the last monitoring leads and ensured James was hydrated before escorting him back to his quarters. As they walked through the station corridors, Ka Rule observed James carefully. He still looked slightly tired, but his movements were steady. His body language suggested confidence, not weakness. Even after enduring what should have been a debilitating experience, he was upright and functioning. Ka Rule shook his head. You continued to defy my expectations. James smirked. That a good thing or a bad thing? Ka Rule considered. Unsettling. James laughed. Hey, I'll take it. When they reached James' quarters, the human leaned against the doorframe. Appreciate you looking out for me, he said. I know I probably freaked you out a bit. Ka Rule hesitated before admitting it was not an easy experience. James nodded. Yeah, I get it, but you did good, Doc. Ka Rule wasn't sure he deserved that praise. He had panicked, assumed the worst, and nearly subjected James to unnecessary medical interventions. But James didn't seem to hold that against him. Get some rest, Ka Rule said at last, and no more bad decisions regarding your intake. James grinned. No promises. Ka Rule sighed, already bracing for the next baffling human crisis. Ka Rule had assumed, foolishly, that James would take his recovery period seriously. It had been a mere 2 cycles since James' fever broke, and already, Ka Rule found himself storming through the station corridors, his mind caught between irritation and concern. The distress call had come from the station's maintenance sector. A human was injured. Given that there were only 3 humans aboard the Velmari, and 2 of them were currently planetside, it didn't take much deduction to figure out who it was. Ka Rule arrived at the maintenance wing to find a small group gathered near a section of the ventilation system. A Ziraki engineer, her 4 spindly arms folded in exasperation, gestured toward an open access panel. "He's in there." Ka Rule's mandibles clicked in frustration. He crouched and peered into the vent. Sure enough, James was wedged inside, his uniform smeared with dust and coolant residue. A deep gash ran along his forearm, and crimson blood dripped steadily onto the metal below. Ka Rule inhaled sharply. James. James twisted his head around, awkwardly wedged between the conduit pipes. "Oh, hey Doc." Ka Rule clenched his jaw. "You were instructed to rest." James winced as he shifted, his arm pressing against the vent wall. "Yeah, about that." The engineer sighed. He insisted on helping repair a coolant leak. Then he lost his balance and got cut on an exposed bracket. Ka Rule pinched the bridge of his nose. And now he is lodged in a ventilation shaft. Temporarily, James corrected. Ka Rule exhaled through his nasal slits, pressing down his frustration. "Can you move?" James tried to shift again and grunted. Not easily." The Ziraki engineer rolled her eyes. "We could cut the panel open, but it would take time." Ka Rule shook his head. No need, he reached into the vent and grabbed James' uninjured arm. On 3, 1. James barely had time to react before Ka Rule yanked him free with one sharp pull. James yelped, his body tumbling out of the shaft and landing in an undignified sprawl on the floor. He groaned, rubbing his bruised side. Not cool. Ka Rule ignored him, already scanning the wound. The gash was deep but not catastrophic. Still, the steady blood loss was concerning. "You are reckless," Ka Rule muttered, pressing a clotting agent against the wound. James hissed but didn't pull away. Was just trying to help. Ka Rule gave him a sharp look. "You were not cleared for strenuous activity yet." James sighed. "Look, they needed an extra set of hands. I felt fine." Ka Rule tightened the temporary bandage around James' arm, his movements precise. Feeling fine is not equivalent to being fully recovered. James exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, I get that now." Ka Rule glanced up at him. James wasn't grinning this time, nor making light of the situation. His face was drawn, his usual energy dulled by fatigue. Ka Rule softened slightly. "Come, medical bay, now." James nodded, standing with a little less steadiness than before. The walk back was quiet, James clearly too drained to make conversation. Once inside the medical bay, Ka Rule guided him onto the exam table and began cleaning the wound properly. "You are fortunate," Ka Rule murmured as he worked. "Another few centimeters, and you would have severed an arterial line." James gave a tired chuckle. "Guess I lucked out, huh?" Ka Rule didn't smile. "This is not luck. This is negligence." James sighed, rubbing his face with his uninjured arm. "Yeah, I messed up." Ka Rule paused, surprised by the admission. He had expected deflection or another attempt at humor. Instead, James just looked. Exhausted. Ka Rule resumed stitching the wound. "You push beyond your limits too easily." James exhaled. "It's a human thing. We don't like sitting still." Ka Rule shook his head. "There is a difference between perseverance and foolishness." James smirked slightly. "Yeah, I'm starting to see that." Ka Rule finished the sutures and applied a final bandage. "You will not repeat this mistake." James raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Ka Rule gave him a flat look. "If you attempt to strain yourself again, I will personally disable your access to all non-essential station functions." James grinned. "You'd really lock me out of everything." Ka Rule met his gaze evenly. "Try me." For a moment, James just stared at him. Then, to Ka Rule's surprise, he laughed. It wasn't his usual amused chuckle, but something warmer, more genuine. All right, James said, raising his good hand in surrender. I'll take it easy. Ka Rule wasn't entirely convinced, but he nodded. See that you do. James leaned back against the medical bed, his expression thoughtful. You know, you're a good medic. Ka Rule blinked. I simply do my duty. James shook his head. Nah, you care. That's different. Ka Rule didn't know how to respond to that. James smiled, then let out a long breath. Guess I'll be sticking to light duty for a while. Ka Rule crossed his arms. Yes, you will. James smirked. Gonna keep babysitting me. Ka Rule tilted his head. If that is required. James chuckled, shaking his head. You're all right, Doc. Ka Rule wasn't sure he fully understood human resilience yet, but he was beginning to understand James. And for now, that was enough. Ka Rule found himself watching James more closely in the days that followed. Not out of suspicion, though the human had certainly proven himself prone to reckless decisions, but out of curiosity. James had, against Ka Rule's expectations, actually adhered to the doctor's orders regarding rest. He wasn't completely idle. Of course, humans, as James had pointed out, struggled with stillness. But he kept his activities to light duties, mostly assisting with minor repairs and organizing supply inventories. Ka Rule still checked in frequently, ensuring the human wasn't overexerting himself or aggravating his injury. But what intrigued him most wasn't James' slow physical recovery, it was the way he interacted with the station's other inhabitants. In the mess hall, he greeted every species as if they were old friends. He shared food with a Velmari technician, despite their species' notoriously strong aversion to human cuisine. He exchanged jokes with the Gruul security officer, a species known for their intimidating presence but deeply ingrained sense of honor. Even the typically reserved Velmari medical staff had warmed to him, something Ka Rule had not seen happen so quickly with any other non-Velmari personnel. Ka Rule observed all of this with growing fascination. Humans were social creatures, yes, but James' ability to integrate into such a diverse environment so effortlessly was remarkable. One evening, as Ka Rule was reviewing a new medical report, his communicator chirped. Ka Rule, came James' voice, a little too cheerful. Quick question, how bad is it if someone gets a mild electric shock? Ka Rule's mandibles twitched. James.
Yeah.
Are you currently experiencing electrocution? A pause. Not anymore? Ka Rule exhaled sharply and grabbed his medkit before making his way to the maintenance bay. When he arrived, James was sitting on a supply crate, shaking out his right hand while a Velmari engineer looked on, their bioluminescent eyes flickering in what Ka Rule recognized as exasperation. Ka Rule crossed his arms. Explain. James grinned sheepishly. Okay, so in my defense, the panel wasn't supposed to be live. The engineer clicked their mandibles. Human James failed to verify this before touching it. Ka Rule pinched the bridge of his nose. Show me your hand. James held it out, palm up. The skin was reddened, but there were no signs of severe burns or nerve damage. Ka Rule scanned him anyway, ensuring there were no deeper complications. You are fortunate, Ka Rule muttered. Again. James flexed his fingers. Yeah, I seem to have a knack for that. Ka Rule sighed. You must exercise greater caution. James nodded. Noted. Ka Rule wasn't convinced, but he let it go. Are you experiencing dizziness? Tingling beyond the immediate sight of contact?
Nope.
Just a little numb, but it's already fading. Ka Rule studied him for a moment before nodding. Very well. If symptoms worsen, you will report to medical immediately. James saluted with his injured hand. Yes, sir. Ka Rule turned to leave but hesitated. James.
Yeah.
Ka Rule considered his words carefully. You form connections with others with ease. James blinked. Thanks. It is not an idle compliment, Ka Rule said. Many species aboard this station maintain distance. You do not. James scratched the back of his head. I mean, yeah. I guess I don't see a reason to. Ka Rule tilted his head. Even when our cultures, physiologies, and ideologies differ. James smiled slightly. Especially then. Ka Rule regarded him in silence for a few moments before nodding. An interesting perspective. James chuckled. You should try it sometime. Ka Rule huffed. I am not as socially adept as you. James grinned. You're not as bad as you think. Ka Rule wasn't sure he believed that, but he let the conversation end there. Over the next few cycles, James continued to recover, and Ka Rule found himself engaging more with the station's crew, partially to ensure James wasn't getting himself into further trouble, but also because, against all logic, he found himself drawn into the human's orbit. It was a strange realization, but not an unwelcome one. Perhaps humans weren't just resilient in body. Perhaps their greatest strength lay in their ability to connect. Ka Rule still didn't fully understand humans, but for now, understanding James was enough.